Hi, everyone. My name is Kat Romano, and I'm the Programming and Human Rights Coordinator here at the Montreal Holocaust Museum, and I want to welcome you to our event today. Before we begin, I just want to go over a little bit of housekeeping. All attendees will be kept on mute during the event, and today's discussion will be followed by a Q&A, and you can ask all your questions in the Q&A box on this Zoom call. If you have any technical difficulties, you can message my colleague Haley Wales, and she'll be able to help you with any problems. And now I'd like to pass it over to Sarah Fogg, Head of Communications at the museum, who will give the introduction today.
Thank you, Kat. So as Kat mentioned, my name is Sarah and I'm Head of Communications here at the Montreal Holocaust Museum. We'd like to thank you for attending today's event, the latest in a series of webinars called What History Teaches, organized in partnership with the Alabama Holocaust Education Center, the Holocaust Resource Center of Buffalo, the Holocaust Museum LA, the Holocaust Center for Humanity, the Nancy and David Wolf Holocaust at Humanity Center, and the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center. Today's presentation comes at a crucial moment in our history, when the lessons of the past are desperately needed to combat contemporary forms of hate, division, and extremism. This powerful webinar series explores how democracy eroded and extremism took root in 1930s Germany, and the urgent lessons we can draw today. Our discussion about the loss of women's rights under the Third Reich will be presented by Deborah Barton, Associate Professor of Modern European History at the Université de Montréal. Her research interests center on gender, media, and fascism. Her book, Writing and Rewriting the Reich, Women Journalists in the Nazi and Post-War Press, 1933 to 1955, was shortlisted for the Waterloo Center for German Studies 2023 Book Prize. Without further ado, over to you, Deborah Barton.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you very much for the invite to be with you here today, and for all the participants for attending, which I think is a very important series of talks. As Sarah said, the topic of my talk is women and the Third Reich, how Nazism impacted the rights of women. And although the umbrella sort of reason for this series is what history teaches us, I'm not going to specifically draw comparisons to contemporary politics or circumstances, only because I want to leave that open for interpretation. But I think you will certainly see some parallels with regard to rhetoric, threats, and policies targeted towards women or certain groups of women in various countries and regions today. The talk will be sort of very broad strokes because we don't have a lot of time, but we can certainly address more specific examples and whatnot during the question period. So I'll just jump right in. In 1933, Jewish journalist Martha Wertheimer was fired from her position on the Offenbacher Zeitung. The loss of her job left her impoverished. With her career curtailed and no further professional opportunities available to her, Wertheimer devoted herself to aiding the Jewish community, in particular Jewish women, who were largely responsible for their family's survival throughout the course of the Third Reich. Wertheimer died in June 1942 on transport to a killing center in the East. At the same time, non-Jewish journalists and journalist hopefuls, including women, were beneficiaries of the regime's so-called purging of internal enemies from the media. And as we know, the regime considered Jewish Germans their principal enemy. So one of the hallmarks of the Nazi period was how the persecution of certain groups in the population dovetailed with the perceptions of increased privilege and opportunities for other groups. And women were both the victims, but could also be the beneficiaries of these processes. So as the description for the talk stated, I will focus on the loss of rights for women in general during the Third Reich, but I also want to sort of highlight the experiences and the loss of rights for women within certain communities and groups that the regime positioned as enemies from within, or enemies within. So this includes political women, certainly social democrats and communists, so-called asocial women, and this is a group that the Roma and Sinti fell into, and of course, Jewish women. And I want to point out that Nazi ideology was double-edged. It sought to include the so-called desirable population, those who the regime termed Aryan Germans, in a united Volksgemeinschaft or people's community. But along with this was the exclusion, removal, and eventual destruction of the so-called undesirable population. So those who the regime considered social, political, and so-called racial enemies. And so it's these policies of inclusion and exclusion that frame or that define Nazi Germany and that also frame my talk today. I'm just going to give you a brief structure so you know what's coming. I'm going to start out very briefly by addressing the situation for women towards the end of the Weimar Republic. And of course, the Weimar Republic was Germany's democracy that was put in place from 1919, or that was in place from 1919 to 1932. And this is important because there are some elements of continuity with regard to women's experiences that bridge the 1933 coming to power of the Nazi regime. After talking about Weimar, I'll touch briefly on Nazi gender ideology, and I want to highlight the contradictions between Nazi rhetoric and the reality of Nazi policy and actions towards women. I'll then discuss specific policies and experiences related to women's employment, then look at how the state intervened in or sought to govern women's reproductive and corporeal agency. And here we'll see how the regime's sexist and racist policies really overlap. And finally, I want to touch briefly on how women who were considered part of the people's community could negotiate opportunities within the context of the Nazi dictatorship. So we'll discuss sort of how opportunism and authoritarianism converge. And because I work on women in the press, I will use that as one brief example. So the Weimar Constitution, actually, let me start by sharing my screen. Okay, so the Weimar Constitution of 1919 marked Germany's transition from a constitutional monarchy to a democracy. And this constitution was also a step forward for women. It was really the model of a progressive constitution, and it guaranteed equal rights for women, including the right to vote and the right to hold office. And I want to point out that Germany was actually one of the first countries in Europe to do this, to take this step. By comparison, France only gave women the vote in 1944, and Switzerland only in 1971. So women became more visible in the public realm during the Weimar period. You have an increasing number, not a large number, but an increasing number of young middle class women or lower middle class women who start to gain more independence. They begin to work outside the home, often as secretaries or in department stores. They're out on the streets with their friends. They go to cafes, dancing, they wear makeup, they cut their hair. And this was the sort of celebrated booby cup or bob for women that many women wore. So this is the iconic image of the so-called new woman. But the idea and the image of the new woman was that it was just more image than reality, because it didn't apply to a large percentage of German women at that stage. Despite this, the very idea or notion of this new woman and changing gender roles loomed large and caused unease and consternation amongst more conservative segments of the population during the Weimar Republic. And the idea of the new woman was a central focus of Nazi criticism of gender roles and relations in the 1920s and 1930s. Despite some gains, progress for women was also limited during the Weimar Republic. Politically, women remained underrepresented in parliament, and they continued to face legal restrictions and a lack of input over bodily autonomy. And one example of this is the ongoing criminalization of abortion. And I bring this up because, as we'll see, sort of biopolitical control over women's bodies was a central element of Nazi ideology and policy, both for women, so-called Aryan women included in the people's community, and those deemed Germany's internal enemies. With regard to employment, a large percentage of women worked outside the home during the Weimar Republic, sort of working class women, and they were most often confined to lower paying factory or domestic jobs. So while women gained new rights and greater social visibility as professionals, as workers, as consumers during the Weimar Republic, full emancipation was still far from achieved. Throughout the Weimar Republic, Nazi rhetoric loudly decried the new woman, and propaganda argued that women's place in the public sphere and this shift, however slight, away from traditional gender roles and relations was undermining the strength of the German state. Hitler had very specific aims for women. Their role was to be in the home as a wife and a mother. And so you have this sort of famous Nazi ideology of the three Ks, Kinder, Kirche, Küche, or children, church, and kitchen. So in this way, as wives and mothers, German women were to serve the German folk, or the German people, by producing racially pure children. And I'll come back to this idea of race shortly. A 1933 pamphlet from the National Socialist Women's League noted, and I quote, "Your body does not belong to you. It belongs to your offspring and to the people." So organizations like the National Socialist Women's League spread propaganda that promoted women's roles in the home as wives and mothers. And from a young age, girls were trained to embrace their domestic roles. Membership in the Nazi League of German Girls, or the Bund Deutscher Mädel, began at age 10. And this group reinforced this domestic ideal for German girls. Politics was to be exclusively a male domain in the Third Reich. So the Nazi regime took steps to exclude women, or certain women, from public life. Like their male counterparts, socialist, communist, and liberal parliamentary members at the national and municipal level were subject to dismissal, coercion, and violence soon after Hitler gained power. And communist and social democratic party members and supporters found themselves under threat as well. Women, like men, were harassed by the Gestapo, or political women and men, I should say, and that was the secret police. Their homes and offices of political women were searched. And prominent political women who were unable or did not flee into exile were often brutally interrogated and beaten. And women, like men, were arrested and imprisoned. Now, women were also held hostage for politically active male relatives who had fled or were in hiding. And again, social democrat or communist opponents of the regime. So women were held hostage. Now, you didn't really have the reverse, where men were held hostage for politically active women in hiding. And again, this repression is targeted towards the regime's political opponents, whether male or female. But it is important to mention because women lose the right to political opinions. Overall, steps to remove all women from the public realm, however, were limited, despite Nazi gender rhetoric about women belonging in the home. So I'm going to turn to women at work in general. I mentioned at the beginning that there was an element of continuity between the last years of the Third Reich and the last years of Weimar and the first years of the Third Reich. The worldwide financial crisis that began in 1929 hit Germany especially hard, with millions of people losing their jobs. In the context of such a high level of unemployment, there was increasing resentment about women in the workforce. So anger and rhetoric were particularly focused on so-called double earners. And that was married women in the workforce whose husbands were also working and earning a salary. So you have tensions around women in the workplace already during Weimar, but it was largely, not solely, but largely related to mass unemployment. Now, shortly after coming to power, the Nazi regime put programs in place both to persuade and to force married women to leave work and to devote their full attention to raising a family. And these steps were taken because, according to Nazi ideology, women should be focused on the private sphere. But it's important to mention that it was also a response to the unemployment crisis. So the Nazi government offered, for instance, very generous bonuses to newlyweds in order to encourage marriage. But couples had to meet certain requirements to qualify for these marriage loans. The woman could not have paid work outside the home, nor could either member of the couple have Jewish ancestry going back 2 generations. And again, this is the point I'll return to. But these marriage laws were an incentive for women to stay out of the workforce. So it does restrict their ability to work. At the same time, unmarried people had to pay a singles tax equivalent to between 2 and 5% of an average salary. Since working women earned less than men, this singles tax hit them harder. So along with the bribe for women to marry and stay in the home, there's also a deterrent to remaining single. But leaving the workforce was not always a voluntary decision for women living under the Nazi dictatorship. In June 1933, for example, a law designated the dismissal of married women from the civil service. A 1934 decree ordered that all doctors remain single. By 1937, Hitler had banned all women from jobs in the highest echelons of the civil service. The regime also restricted women's enrollment in universities, so it was restricted to 10%. And they took steps such as banning women from serving on juries because women were, and I quote, unable to think logically and make a rational decision, end of quote. So there were more decrees, but those are just to give you an idea of the steps taken, particularly to target married women. So laws like the ones I just mentioned certainly did make certain women victims of Nazi gender ideology. But as with so many aspects of Nazism, the regime's gender ideology was markedly different from reality because it was in conflict with the needs of the German economy and Hitler's foreign policy. And by this, I mean his planning for the eventual war that he intended. The German economy needed women to work outside the home, particularly as plans were put in place in 1936 to orient the economy for war. So here's an element of continuity with Weimar. Throughout the 1930s, women continued to be clustered in low-paying factory jobs where they earned less than men, even when doing the same work, or they were sort of relegated to working in professions deemed appropriate for women, such as nursing and social work. So again, you have similarities to Weimar. Nazism, like all fascist movements, was deeply inherently sexist. But as it relates to the reality of women in the workplace, other than some of the laws I just mentioned, Germany was not that different from other European countries, democracies and dictatorships alike, where women were also generally relegated to poorly paid women's work. The biggest, or the real difference, I guess you could say, in Nazi ideology and practice was the so-called racial component. So this brings me to a discussion about women's bodies, reproductive and corporeal agency. In Nazi ideology, a larger and so-called racially pure population was seen as essential to strengthening Germany's military power and providing settlers for the territories in Eastern Europe that Germany would conquer through Hitler's planned war. So this is the idea of Lebensraum, that the Germans needed room to expand, and this was going to be into Polish and Soviet territories. So the idea was that to maintain these territories as Germany's, the regime would need German soldiers and settlers to populate these regions in Eastern Europe and to Germanize them. To achieve this goal related to Lebensraum, the regime pursued aggressive population policies, urging so-called racially pure women, so this idea of Aryan women, to have as many children as possible. At the same time, women the regime deemed unfit or not part of the Nazi community, the Nazi people's community, were to be prevented from having children because such offspring would weaken the German nation. In other words, the regime considered control over women's bodies as a critical element of its population and foreign policy. Measures targeted towards ensuring that desirable or so-called Aryan German women gave birth to several children included the attempt to eliminate or efforts to eliminate abortion altogether and restrict contraception in the Third Reich. So abortion had already been illegal under paragraph 218 of the 1871 German Penal Code. And abortion was illegal in Weimar, although it did take place. But during the Weimar Republic, you also have debates around the question of legalizing abortion and giving women control over their reproductive, or giving women reproductive rights. But no legislation was passed that did legalize abortion. However, the Nazi regime applied the law, so paragraph 218, much more severely than had been applied during Weimar. And at least when it came to women deemed racially valuable. So women who obtained abortions could face or did face prison sentences, often of several years. Doctors and midwives who performed abortions on so-called desirable women also faced extremely harsh penalties. Between 1933 and 1938, there was a 65% increase in yearly convictions and prison sentences related to paragraph 218. So this includes women who were caught, who'd had an abortion and been denounced or were caught, as well as the doctors and midwives that performed them. Beginning in 1935, doctors and midwives were obliged to notify the regional state health office of every woman who had suffered a miscarriage, or every woman they treated who had suffered a miscarriage. So women's names and addresses were then handed over to the police, who investigated the cases they suspected of actually being abortions rather than miscarriages. So there's increased surveillance and intrusion into women's reproductive capabilities and into the decisions related to their own bodies. By 1943, abortion for so-called Aryan women was classified as high treason against the German people. So Nazi pro-natalist policies and actions were actually linked to anti-natalist policies as well. So what do I mean by this? The regime sought to prevent certain women from reproducing. On January 1st, 1934, the law for the prevention of hereditarily deceased offspring came into effect. And this was a law against the so-called propagation of lives unworthy of lives. It mandated sterilization for certain categories of people with perceived so-called mental and physical defects, including, for example, people with physical disabilities or restrictions. Epileptics were targeted under the sterilization law, those suffering from illnesses such as schizophrenia, alcoholics, as well as those the regime deemed asocial. It's clear that this law was a form of Nazi racism and social control. The regime sought to prevent what it deemed the degeneration of the race and to remove what it termed the parasitic threat to the body of the German folk. So the categories of those targeted for sterilization were purposefully vague. I mentioned the category asocial, for example. But what the term asocial actually meant or entailed was very ambiguous and malleable. This category could be used against women who were not, according to the regime, subscribing to the appropriate behavior or gender ideals of their class. For example, women could be sterilized for being so-called promiscuous. So that's just one example of how ambiguous this asocial category is. Minorities such as the Roma and Sinti and Black Germans were also targeted for sterilization under the asocial category. And here, somewhere, let me just, oh, I had a picture that unfortunately I deleted. I'll show it to you after, and it's basically of a police officer collecting information about the Roma and Sinti to be used for sterilization purposes and later for deportation purposes. Sterilization of Jewish women, particularly poor women coming from the East, did take place. Especially in cities like Berlin that had a larger Jewish community. But those who were targeted for sterilization at this stage were targeted not because they were Jewish, but because they fell into one of the categories that I just outlined. It's also important to note that at the beginning of 1934, abortion of so-called defective pregnancies on the grounds of race hygiene did become legal. And women who had such abortions were then often sterilized against their will. So it was the women's choice to have the abortion if it was maybe a non-viable pregnancy, but then they were sterilized. While the regime punished abortion in general very harshly, it's important to remember that in some cases, abortion served Nazi racial policies. By 1939, on the eve of the Second World War, over 300,000 Germans were sterilized, and there was an equal balance between men and women. But it was, of course, a more intrusive process for women. And men weren't generally targeted for reasons such as promiscuity. So I want to repeat this point about Nazi policy towards women's bodies. The Nazi state extolled and materially supported motherhood as the proper fate of certain so-called Aryan women, while mandating sterilization for those it deemed unfit, and I quote, the racially and morally deviant. So some women were prevented from accessing abortion or birth control, while others were prevented from giving birth or from reproducing. And we don't have time to explore this next point in detail, but it's very important. Beginning in 1939, such hierarchies of valuable versus inferior life or inclusion and exclusion in the Volksgemeinschaft were used to justify euthanasia and eventually mass killing. So this brings me to the primary target of Nazi vitriol and persecution, and this was the German Jewish community. The regime believed that European Jews belonged to a separate race that was inferior to all other races, so it racialized Judaism. Propaganda loudly proclaimed that the presence of Jews in Germany was a threat to the German people and the German state, and therefore the Jewish community had to be separated from other Germans to protect and strengthen Germany. As soon as it assumed power, the regime began implementing anti-Semitic policies aimed at the isolation, or what Marion Kaplan termed the social death, of Germany's Jewish citizens. From 1933 onward, there was really this insidious creeping persecution that legally excluded Jewish Germans, men and women alike, from professional employment and banished them from civic, social, cultural, intellectual, and economic life in Germany. So there are over 400 decrees targeted towards the German Jewish community throughout the 1930s. While no major Nazi laws explicitly singled out Jewish women as a separate and legal category, a number of laws, decrees, and policies had gender-specific effects within the broader framework of anti-Jewish persecution. And this is particularly important because between 1933 and 1939, the ratio of Jewish women to men residing in Germany increases. Men were more likely to immigrate, often because prior to the Second World War, they did face higher risks of arrest under Nazi policies or economic exclusion as well. Women tended to be the caregivers for families, and this included children and elderly relatives. So they faced greater obstacles to leaving Germany. Immigration was, of course, very difficult and costly, and some countries restricted entry of individuals over a certain age. So you had a higher percentage of women who stayed behind, often to care for elderly relatives who couldn't easily immigrate. So the loss of rights and the persecution of the Jewish community during the 1930s is felt particularly harshly by women in certain ways, and we'll talk about those. Given the number of laws and actions that impacted Germany's Jewish community, I'm just going to focus on a few, a couple larger ones and one less well known. And I'm going to start with a couple that actually did impact professional women. In April 1933, you had the law for the prevention of the law for the restoration of the professional civil service. And so this law excluded political opponents and Jewish Germans from public service positions such as teachers, judges, and other civil servants. The goal was to create a racially pure and ideologically controlled civil service. Because amongst the educated and employed Jewish women, many tended to work in teaching or social welfare, this law had an immediate impact on their livelihoods. In October 1933, the regime passed the Editor's Law, or the Schriftleiter Gesetz, that forbade so-called non-Aryans from working in journalism and working in the media. And I mention this law in particular because it relates back to how I opened the talk with the case of Jewish journalist Martha Wertheimer, who lost her livelihood in the fall of 1933 as the media comes under ideological control of the regime. By 1934, 10% of journalists had been removed from the press, and within this number, approximately 10% were women. So women were impacted by laws related to sort of economic exclusion and removal from the professional arena. Between 1933 and 1938, there was a series of decrees that excluded Jewish Germans from public welfare organizations. Jewish women who had worked as nurses, as midwives, or as caregivers eventually lost their licenses. Jewish doctors' licenses were increasingly restricted from 1933 onwards, and they lost their licenses in 1938. At the same time, Jewish women were denied access to hospitals and maternity wards. In 1938, Jewish women were also banned from working as domestics in so-called Aryan households. And this is important to mention because it was a severe economic blow, since domestic work had been one of the last available livelihoods that had allowed women to support their entire families after their male partners had lost their professions or lost their ability to earn. Two of the most critical laws I'm just going to cover very briefly were announced in September 1935, and this was under the umbrella of the Nuremberg laws, which you've probably heard of. The first of these laws was the Reich citizenship law, which stripped Jewish Germans of their German citizenship and the rights that went with it. And there was also the law for the protection of German blood and honor that criminalized marriage and sexual relations between Jewish Germans and so-called Aryans. So there was the loss of the ability to choose a partner. As I mentioned, the Nazi regime targeted Jewish women first and foremost as Jews and not as women. However, there were gendered repercussions to Nazi persecution and to the Nuremberg laws. Men were most often the family's breadwinners. And as they lost their jobs, they tended to become more isolated from interaction with other Germans, or they could isolate themselves. Women couldn't do that because it was women as wives and mothers who generally took care of the family, shopping, preparing the meals, and so forth. And of course, single women had to take care of themselves. And from 1933 onwards, this becomes increasingly difficult and stressful. So you could almost say it was women who are on the front lines because as they're out on the streets, going about their business, for example, shopping for food, they experienced hostility, a barrage of insults, and occasionally were the targets of physical violence. After the 1935 Nuremberg laws, the Jewish community sort of seeks to respond to the loss of rights. And you see in newspapers an increasing number of articles that offer advice to overworked and overwrought Jewish women who, as I said, are sort of responsible for their family's survival. So these articles, these newspaper articles really demonstrate the mounting strain the persecution and loss of rights place on Jewish women. Traditional gender norms sort of allowed women or Jewish women greater freedom of movement in public before the Second World War. So as a result, women were compelled to assume more visible and assertive roles in the public life as they took responsibility for protecting their families. So just a couple of examples. It was often women who went from office to office seeking permission and visas to secure their husbands and their families' immigration to safety. Likewise, women frequently took the lead in negotiating or securing the release of detained family members who were imprisoned in concentration camps or imprisoned by the Gestapo. And women took considerable risks in undertaking these tasks. For instance, they exposed themselves again to harassment, to violence, to sexual harassment, to sexual violence, and also to the possibility of imprisonment. So at a time when Nazi ideology was sort of loudly reaffirming male privilege and the need to relegate so-called Aryan women to the home, even if there was this gap between reality and rhetoric, the loss of the rights of Jewish community overall meant that Jewish women had to take on new roles as breadwinners, often learning new skills and working long hours outside and inside the home. So all German women lived under the misogynistic Nazi dictatorship. But the loss of rights of women in the Third Reich was not even across the board, which I hope I've been able to briefly demonstrate. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, women were not only victims of Nazism, although this was a view that was held for decades after the war. Scholarship has helped dispel this perception, and historians like Wendy Lauer and Elizabeth Harvey have since focused on how women contributed to and in some ways could benefit from Nazism. So I'm going to change course now to briefly talk about how some so-called Aryan women could negotiate opportunities for themselves even within a patriarchal fascist dictatorship. And as I said, we don't have a lot of time, so I'm just going to focus on what I know best, which is women in the press. In 1937, a young trainee journalist, Ursula von Kardorf, began her first internship at the Nazi party newspaper Der Angriff. In 1939, she joined the permanent staff at the prominent Deutsche Allgemeine Zeitung, where she wrote for the features sections and the so-called women's pages. In letters to friends and family, Kardorf described her position as one that brought her great pleasure and satisfaction. So she enjoyed her career despite the numerous limitations that women faced in the male-dominated field and the controlled nature of the Nazi press, which required journalists to act as mouthpiece for the regime. Although she was not particularly fervent supporter of Nazism, Kardorf contributed to the regime's press and propaganda goals through her writing. So she worked in what was termed soft news, or the soft news areas. And Kardorf produced sometimes humorous, entertaining, or light articles intended to demonstrate to Germans that life was normal. Life continued on as normal under the Nazi regime. Nazi press officials valued women journalists like Kardorf because they believed they could write in a more colorful, emotional, and entertaining way than men. And that's actually a quote. So the regime saw women's journalism as a way to influence the public, especially German women, through charm and subtlety, rather than the very sort of militant language, aggressive militant language that dominated most of the press, or certainly the front pages of newspapers. So as a result, Nazi press authorities really sought to channel women journalists into these soft news realms. And this included generally features, local news and travel, and most often the women's pages of newspapers, which typically consisted of fashion articles, advice columns, domestic news, articles on child rearing, and so forth. So although these sections weren't very prestigious to work in, these areas in the newspaper were amongst the most popular for men and women alike. It gave them a way to sort of it was sections where they could sort of escape overt Nazi ideology. So these sections comprised a central part of the Nazi propaganda platform. They helped isolate Germans from the terror and destruction of the regime, and I'll come back to this point as well. But in this way, women journalists could play, or did play, an important role in helping to stabilize the Nazi state and the regime, at least in relation to their numbers. That said, due to the deep-rooted sexism inherent in the Nazi system, women journalists faced numerous obstacles in their profession, and they rarely obtained positions considered important or prominent within the press. But here again, there's room for negotiation. Because I said rarely. There was a small group of women who had the connections, the education, often the language skills, the ambition, and most often a male advocate. And so certain women journalists were able to find success outside these sort of fields reserved for women, or these areas of soft news where most female journalists were relegated. There were women working in the Nazi press as foreign correspondents, for example. So some women did write about Nazi foreign policy, and others even covered various wars. So women journalists could contribute to more overtly Nazified news. Most, however, worked in this soft news realm. And the regime's desire for women journalists to provide these sort of lighter articles led to more opportunities for women. Nazi press authorities created promotional material to recruit women into journalism, and they bore fruit. Over the course of the Third Reich, the percentage of women in journalism grew. So from 5% at the end of Weimar to 11% on the eve of World War II. And of course, the war opens up even more opportunities for women journalists as men are conscripted to the front. So why did the regime put effort into recruiting women into the press? The writing of most female journalists was an important but subtle factor in helping the regime pursue its aggressive social and political agenda. So, by writing human interest stories or lighter articles, women journalists contributed to the regime's political goal of maintaining a sense of normality and enjoyment amongst the population, amongst the readers. They helped create a positive image for Nazi Germany that helped Germans look away from the violence and persecution perpetrated in their name against so-called enemies, first within Germany, the internal enemies, and then throughout Europe. This normal, even happy face of Nazism was built on a foundation of repression of those considered socially, politically, or racially suspect or inferior. So women helped to normalize the regime through their writing. And I was thinking about this issue of dictatorship and normality in today's world, because I recently read an article in The Atlantic with the title, "Authoritarianism Feels Surprisingly Normal Until It Doesn't. Life in Venezuela was deceptively mundane, then everything collapsed." So that was the title of the article. And this really does relate to life in the Third Reich for those who are included in the people's community. Life could seem normal and mundane until the war, or even until the last years of the war, when the collapse of normality became very real, even for those in the Volksgemeinschaft. And so the writing of women journalists helps to create this notion of normality. And I think I have time to give you one example of how women journalists entertained and amused the German population during the 1930s. The Berliner Lokalanzeiger was the newspaper with the largest circulation during the Third Reich. Most of the articles in the women's pages were, of course, targeted towards women. However, some were targeted to men. And that's sort of one indication that men also read this type of material, these lighter sections. In December 1934, journalist Carola Ehlenberg wrote several articles advising men on how to buy gifts for their wives and children. And these articles were both intended to be helpful, but they also sort of were tongue-in-cheek, and they had a little bit of humor about couples and how women received presents from men. So I quote, "The most important thing is to give personalized gifts. While a small bottle of perfume could change a woman's whole world, expensive but less thoughtful gifts were not always so well received. I knew a rather wealthy man who had given his wife an onion grater, a new lamp, a cookbook, and a vacuum cleaner. Yet his wife was delighted with a cheap and cheerful necklace because it was a little bauble that she wouldn't buy for herself." So Ehlenberg's articles on shopping and domestic life were a part of the genre that was important to the regime. Her writings evoked personal pleasure and also harmonious family relationships. Moreover, these articles served to encourage consumption, which helped fulfill individual desires, but it also had national consequences. Because during the early years of the Third Reich, individual consumption acted as a stimulus for the economy. So these articles, even though they don't appear to be political, are political. Their seemingly innocuous articles also had a racial component, because they either implied or even stated out overtly that good Germans only bought German products. They didn't buy products from, quote, made by Jews or influenced by degenerates. So even fashion articles were political in their effect, if they're not in their designation. And we can talk about that a little bit more if you have questions about that. But I want to conclude with what women found appealing about the journalism profession. An important point that emerged from my research is how, in exchange for their support, the Nazi state offered women journalists professional status and a sense of accomplishment and even adventure. In exchange for their work for Nazi Germany, women journalists enjoyed the financial benefits, the travel, and the intellectual stimulation of their work. While their writing often underscored Nazi ideology as it related to women, um, underscoring the ideal of women's influence and importance in the private sphere, women journalists often had the chance to live very unconventional lives, certainly in comparison to most women. And one example, Erika Groth Schmachtberger was a freelance photographer um, and who established a very successful career during the Third Reich, and it allowed her to travel. She was able to buy a car, which gave her a degree of independence not available to most women. She traveled all over Europe, and she remarked that she loved the freedom that her profession afforded her. But at the same time, her photographs and her photojournalism underscored the sort of Nazi goals in relation to women. So, what does this say about gender and complicity? Women could take advantage of opportunities offered in Germany during the 1930s. And by doing so, they became agents, witnesses, and beneficiaries in the systematic violence that their writing sort of could ignore or could veil. So they occupied a position within the Nazi dictatorship that embodies what historian Michael Rothberg called implicated subjects. Although women journalists did not commit acts of violence, they contributed to and benefited from an repressive regime. They became sort of important cogs in the machinery of power and oppression in Nazi Germany. And so what I sort of tried to do with this very brief look at women's rights in the Third Reich is to point out there's a variety of experiences for the lives of women under the Third Reich. The Nazi gender policies and practice certainly had the ability to strip rights from all women, but in practice, certain groups of women uh, um, were sort of impacted more harshly by Nazism and persecuted more harshly by Nazism, while others could find ways to benefit from the regime. Or to benefit from Nazism. And I gave the importance of the press, but there's other examples of women who worked in many different realms or even committed or contributed to Nazism through their position as wives. So thank you for your attention, and I look forward to any questions.
Thank you so much, Deborah. That was so interesting. Just as a reminder for everyone, if you want to type your questions into the Q&A or the chat, we're happy to answer them. And we do have a first question, basically making a link with contemporary society. Someone would like to know if you're making a link with the history that you spoke about and efforts today really around the world to promote control over women, notably related to work and safe medical abortions. Is there any parallel that we can draw with the history?
Well, thank you for bringing that up. That's exactly sort of what I had hoped to do, was to leave that sort of open for interpretation. In my opinion, yes, there are parallels. Certainly, we can use the States as an example. When Roe versus Wade was overturned and certain states restricting access to abortion, either 100% restriction or making it extremely difficult for women who may need an abortion for medical reasons or simply don't want to go through with the pregnancy. So while I think that it's important to draw lessons from the past and look at the parallels, of course there are different historical contexts. But overall, yeah, I think unfortunately, we do see parallels in states that seek to assert control over women's bodily autonomy.
We're getting a few other comments, just, thanking you for the talk and for the links that are really obvious with contemporary society today. We have another question. what sort of options were available to pregnant Jewish women during the Third Reich? Understandably, this wasn't a safe time for them to be having children. What sort of stories did you come across in your research, if any, and were those women forced really to go underground?
So if I understood the question correctly, is it sort of Jewish women who didn't want to go through with pregnancy?
Yes.
Well, see, that's the thing. Paradoxically, the regime was happy to sort of turn the other cheek when it came to abortion for Jewish women because they considered Jewish women or the Jewish community a threat to the German state. So you didn't have the abortion laws applied as strictly. Having said that, there was always difficulty in finding someone willing to perform abortions and finding access to safe termination of pregnancy and treatment. If you look at cases, during the war in concentration camps, it was very dangerous for women to have pregnancies, and so you did have cases where other women would sort of with medical training who were imprisoned as well would perform abortions, for the safety of the woman who was pregnant. Yeah,
We
I hope that.
actually we work very closely with Angie Oros, who was actually born in Auschwitz, and her mother refused the abortion that was offered to her by Gisela Pearl, which is a fascinating history as well.
Yeah, exactly. I believe she was a Polish doctor.
I
She's,
think
I
so.
think so. Yeah, exactly. And yeah, you do have the case where women, certainly where women give birth in the camps as well. But that pregnancy in that situation was extremely dangerous. Yeah,
Mhm.
extremely dangerous for women.
Another question. What was the early response, either by media or just the general public, to the Nazis' early efforts to police women's rights?
The media was controlled immediately as soon as the regime came to power. So in terms of you don't have opposition coming through the press. What you have is sort of, well, I would term it propaganda that sort of congratulates the regime, for these pro-natalist policies and the idea that Germany had been weakened and needed to increase its birth rate. And you have attempts to increase the birth rate all over Europe, but you don't have criticism of the loss of rights or of antinatalist or pronatalist policies really coming through at least the mainstream media because it's controlled right from the start. Yeah.
And on that note of resistance, we have another question. If there are any examples that you came across of people resisting these measures, either by media, journalists, or other,
Resisting measures.
to control women, whether in, workforces or their bodies.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And you come across, I mean, yeah, I've come across cases where women journalists they had access to sort of, I'm trying to think of it here. I guess an inside view, one could say, of the regime. And certainly you had, when I look at sort of memoirs or correspondence of certain women, you had women who worked in the press who weren't supporters of the regime. But again, the resistance tended to be more personal rather than public through the media. So you have cases where women journalists were helping in all sorts of ways, helping to facilitate or abortions or direct women to where they could safely and maybe secretly terminate a pregnancy. But that was done not as journalists, but as private women. So you've got sort of Ruth Andreas Friedrich, who was helping not necessarily women who were pregnant, but was helping Jewish and political women escape the Third Reich. So I sort of merged those both examples, but you don't have, despite claims afterwards, you don't have a lot of resistance against the regime coming through the media. So any journalists that sort of did privately oppose the regime or privately oppose restrictions on women's rights did so as women, and they did so privately. And you can see this in some correspondence, but you really don't see it through the media, other than through underground newspapers. And you have you also have radio from exiled journalists, whether male or female, that are also transmitting into the Third Reich. So that's where you see more of the resistance coming out from things like Radio Moscow and whatnot. There's one journalist, Hedda Zinner, who is exiled to Moscow. She was a communist, and so she works for Radio Moscow, their German stations, which just transmitted illegally into Germany. And she really talks about the misogyny and the convergence of racism and sexism under the Nazi regime. But again, that wasn't done from within the Third Reich. That was done after she fled the Third Reich.
Okay. I think you answered quite a few of the other questions that have come in, but I'm aware of the time, so maybe just one last question. This subject really does seem to interest people greatly. Are there any other books or films or materials you'd like to recommend to people if they'd like to explore this subject a little bit more?
Oh, absolutely. So I didn't mention this during the talk, and I meant to, but I was aware of the time. The historian Marian Kaplan is really a pioneer at looking at Jewish women's experiences in particular. And so it's an older book, but it's called Between Dignity and Despair, and that's an excellent look at the impact of Nazism on Jewish women, so the loss of rights. In terms of other historians, and what's coming to mind is, again, some of the pioneering historians. Jill Stevens has worked on women's rights, Claudia Kuntz. Coming from the other side, or the loss of women's rights, and coming from the other side, historians who have looked at the ways in which women have contributed to the regime. Wendy Lauer's Hitler's Furies is an example. And one of the books that I think really inspired scholarship, and certainly was a book that kind of inspired my interest in women and in their contribution to Nazism, was Elizabeth Harvey's book on women, German women in the Nazi East. So those are a few that I'd recommend. Nothing's coming to mind in terms of film, although I'm sure there are a number, and I'm happy to sort of maybe send the names and the links of a few films after the talk that we can send out as well. But yeah, there's a wealth of scholarship on women and their loss of rights, so women as victims of the regime, and women who supported and contributed and took advantage of opportunities under Nazism, and opportunities that came at the expense of other women.
Mm. Thank you. It's really been so fascinating to hear from you today. Again, I apologize. We're short on time, so I see that there's other questions, but thank you all for your attendance, and thank you, Deborah, and thank you, of course, to our partners, our friends and our colleagues in Alabama, Buffalo, LA, Seattle, Cincinnati, and Illinois. If you're interested in this series, the next event is taking place on October 29th with the Nancy and David Wolf Holocaust and Humanities Center, and it will explore the themes of universities, education, and the role of intellectuals in 1930s Germany. Thank you all so much for attending. And of course, thank you so much, Deborah, for your wonderful presentation. Thank you.
It was a pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Have a great day.